I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm going to be talking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the real Anthony Fauci. And I'm going to ask the question, why is information the virus that has most worried them from the very beginning? If in 2030, we look back and say, oh my God, I don't know how we lived that way, but thank goodness that we did. Thank goodness that the pandemic happened, because without it, we would never be in this place that we are now, where we are so much more connected and secure and happy and thriving. If that were to happen, it would be in large part because of this book, because it puts together this big piece of the puzzle that enables us to be able to see the big picture. There's another book that's out called The United States of Fear, written by a psychologist named Mark McDonald. And even though I don't agree with all of his conclusions, and I might do another episode on it, I certainly agree with his observation that this is not a data war. That has been won a long time ago. This is a psychology war and needs to be treated that way. Winning the data war is because of this book. It answers the question of why they would be so afraid to have this all be put together. So let's look at the psychology of it, and then let's look at what's actually in this book of 480 pages that I have finally finished. The other day, I was talking with a friend who my daughters and I joke is one of the men who we can count on one hand who actually listen. Although, since starting this YouTube, I think I'm up to two hands. So even though he and his wife are very much on the other side of the vaccine wars, as we will call them, I thought we had a good enough rapport to ask him a question that's been bothering me, which is, how was the Kennedy name besmirched? How did it become discredited? When I was growing up, there was no one who was as universally admired as the Kennedys. And so his answer was, well, not all the Kennedys have been discredited, just one of them. And I said, well, I feel like I didn't get that memo. How did that happen? And he said, well, I think because of his research into vaccines. So I pointed out that it seems to me a circular logic, that because of his research into vaccines, Robert F. Kennedy has been discredited, and therefore his research into vaccines is not creditable. So that doesn't make sense, and I will say with great appreciation that my friend is now ordering this book and is on the waiting list for it from the library as one of the most scientifically minded people that I know. Another example is that my indie bookstore, as I mentioned before, has refused to carry it. They will not put it on their shelves. And I was in there the other day checking up on the progress of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, and asked them why. Why would this not be there? Because it seems to me that this is a really important book, no matter what position you take on it. And their answer was, we reviewed it and decided that we will order it for people, but we will not display it. And I said, well, that seems like a contradiction in terms, because as an indie bookstore, my feeling is you trust your readers. You trust people to be able to make decisions for themselves. And you trust them to know how to read and how to read for power and be able to decipher words and understand them. So why would you censor? And his answer was, only a government can censor, which seemed very odd to me, that seemed like a very practiced response. And he said, we just decided that it was not something that we wanted to be associated with. After he left, a woman in the aisle came over and said, "I think that was a really interesting discussion. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I think you made a very good point." So let's just look broadly at what is in this dangerous book. If I just look at chapter headings, the first 150 pages are about COVID and about how pharma profits got put above public health. The next 120 pages are about HIV and AIDS and the history of the mismanagement of that. And then there's 170 are on foreign policy and how vaccines and germ warfare has become a weapon that is being used for imperial advantage. And then the last 50 looks at this whole idea of germ warfare. So if I were to take seriously that someone in the management of my local bookstore read all 480 pages and decided that this was not worth having on their shelves, I'd have to conclude that they were the kind of person who celebrated the deaths of homosexual men in the AIDS epidemic, who thought that African children and Indian children didn't really deserve to live, who believed that sterilization without consent was okay, and who thought that African American children in the U.S. could be sacrificed. I would have to think that they thought biological weapons where disease is inflicted on entire populations as a means of invasion, that was acceptable. That, of course, is absurd. What that means is they never read it. They read a review of it that said, here's what's in this book. Now, I can throw out these conclusions and you can absolutely reject it and say, well, see, that just proves that this is hysterical nonsense. But you haven't read the data. Until you read the data, you can't reject a conclusion. You can read data and you can look at the logic and you can say, here's a flaw and here's this where this conclusion is not validated by this research. But until you do that, you can't reject the research. So why is there this psychological resistance such that it's such an emotional issue that this is the first time ever that I've seen my bookstore reject a book? So how did this happen that the left became co-opted? I've been getting some good traction on my idea that Trump was a propaganda double agent in the comments section. In particular, someone named Chuck Less has written, Trump was a beautiful puppet. Trump thought politics were corrupt and therefore the left could no longer criticize politics. Trump thought Assange was a hero, and so he was abandoned by the left, along with any form of media neutrality. And then Trump wouldn't sign the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and therefore the left suddenly was for it. That one got me also because I really follow trade agreements, and the left was so against it. And now I'm seeing some of those trade organizations saying, yes, we need to make sure that everyone has access to vaccines, as if that was the issue. So everything that Trump was against, the left became for, and everything he was for, they became against. Trump also called out the Bushes for involvement in 9/11 and made anyone who questioned the official narrative into a gullible conspiracy theorist. So how did that combination of truth and lies happen? He, in one breath, talked about hydroxychloroquine and how that was a therapeutic remedy, and in the next said we should inject bleach. This isn't an accident. So we've been talking, Chuck and I, about Is there a word for that? And psyops is one, possibly, but that's typically what you're doing to an enemy. In this case, it's what the state is doing within. It's not exactly propaganda, but it is definitely more of a psychology than anything else. In his book, United States of Fear, Mark McDonald talks about how we were groomed for this early on, going back to the threat of nuclear bombs and all of us hiding under our desks. Was that to make us feel safe, or was that to make us enact the fear? Was it to make us embody that fearfulness? Because certainly anyone who thought about it for a moment knew that wasn't going to do anything. In the same way, our physical masking is a sign that we are afraid. And so having that visibility to fear is something that is very effective about destroying our relationships with each other. When I look at what Kennedy has done in this book, I think it's another thing we don't really have a word for, something that should be called metajournalism. It's a meta-analysis that takes things from history, from current events, from foreign policy, and puts them together and makes sense of them. So he's doing with the medical area what I've tried to do in my book with economics. And I see him perhaps facing the same dilemma of where do you start? The book that I wrote started out being called A 2020 Vision, The Economics of Community. And I started it in 2012, and I reserved the domain a2020vision.org, and I have never used it since, as 2020 came and went. Because what I found is I couldn't talk about the solution without first making sure that people understood the real problem. In economics, what people want is a redistribution of the money. And I needed to go way back to how money started in order to show that it is what I call trading in pieces of slave. It is not power over ourselves. It's only power over others. It's empire chips. And so anthropology was needed in order to go and give the foundation so that we'd have a common vocabulary to talk about the problems. I see Kennedy as saying, okay, well, what people want to hear about is the pandemic. And so I'll start out with that. But what they need to hear about is the history of how we got there. And so his research on HIV and AIDS and the politicization and the profiteering and how that was prioritized over finding a solution is an essential link in understanding that the real problem isn't going to be solved and it's not going to just go away. We don't even want it to just go away. And then he, as I do in my book, goes into foreign policy and looks at a global perspective and how this puts together all of this disregard for lives in other countries and shows that imperial mindset and how it has been manifested through the medical procedures that are not really about saving lives. And finally, Kennedy ends with the last 50 pages on germ warfare. And what I've heard is that he said, if you read nothing else, just read the last chapter. So this is what puts everything together and shows the larger design behind it all. There's one chilling graphic in the book that was taken from Fauci's emails. And what it shows is a March Madness, where he has all these different pandemics that were attempted and how they played off against each other. And this one won, and then that one won, and it played off against over here. And in the end, COVID-19 was the champion. If that doesn't tell you all you need to know about what's going on, I don't know what would. In this pandemic, there is a desire for people to be sick, and any ways in which people can make themselves well are being discouraged. That's the important thing. It's not that the more cautious or the more caring or the people who are taking the more conservative approach, that's not really the ones who are saying, let's go all the way to a vaccine. They're the ones who are saying, let's treat this. Let's have a network of doctors who are on the front line, who are sharing their results and who are looking at repurposing those drugs that have been approved for decades and used widely, which we have millions of doses of, and that have been, in this case, kept away from the public and with doctors being prevented from using them. So since my assumption is that I'm preaching to the choir when I'm talking about the data, I'm not really going to spend time on that, but I want to end with more of a recommendation from my own observations about how we should be with other people and how we can perceive this. As I've mentioned before, I've been studying A Course in Miracles for 18 years, and my reading the other day was, there is nothing more unstable than a tightly organized delusional system. That's what we need to be paying attention to. Not that there is this resistance because there's so much confidence. It's because that delusional system is hanging by a thread. It is this tightly knit fabric, and there's threads that are fraying and are about to break. If you're seen as the person who's coming in with scissors, you're going to hit a lot of anger and resentment. Let it snap on its own. For everyone, that thing is different. For me, it was when Bush said after 9/11, they hate us because we love freedom. And that was such obvious BS that I couldn't understand why no one around me was questioning it. So that was where I went into that state of cognitive dissonance, that the world that I was seeing was not the one that anyone else was seeing. It's a hard place to be in, but people are going to get there, and they're going to get there on their own terms. And what we can do in the meantime is to make them feel safe, to just be as kind as possible with people wherever they're at in this, and just wait it out. That's my recommendation. And I'll bring up one other psychology study that my daughter reminded me of, which is that when people have gone through something where they have sacrificed a lot, either they've sacrificed their dignity and been humiliated, like in hazing for the fraternity, or they've paid a big price, they end up defending that and being more loyal to it than ever, because they have to justify that it was worth it to them. So the more that we look at people paying that price, the more that it makes sense that there is so much resistance. If you'd like to dive more deeply into this particular issue, here's another one on the Real Anthony Fauci, which has been blowing up my YouTube. Thank you to Russell Brand's comment section. And here's also a playlist on media and censorship. But I also recommend going into the ones on ideology and equality and spirituality, because all of these things are intertwined. And I'm also starting a Substack, which is under Third Paradigm there, so I can be writing at the same time, which I love to do. Thank you so much.